She stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, her worn shoes barely visible beneath the hem of a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric bought at a discount store. The chandeliers above sparkled like 1,000 fallen stars, but their light only seemed to illuminate what she wasn't. Wealthy, polished, belonging. She was 23 years old, and tonight she carried a secret that weighed heavier than the shame burning in her cheeks. Stay with me. What happens in the next 30 days will shatter everything you think you know about worth and the ending. It will leave you breathless. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, slipped under her apartment door like a whisper of possibility. Annual Gala for Emerging Entrepreneurs, it read, hosted by the prestigious Hartwell Foundation. She had applied for their business grant 6 months ago, pouring her heart into an application that detailed her dream, a community center in her neighborhood where struggling families could learn skills, find resources, and rebuild their lives. She knew that world intimately. She'd lived it every single day since her father died when she was 15, leaving her mother to raise 3 children on a housekeeper's salary. But as she stepped into that glittering room, surrounded by men in tailored suits and women draped in jewelry that could feed her family for a year, she felt the dream slipping through her fingers like sand. The marble floors reflected her image back at her, distorted and small, a ghost among giants. She clutched her worn purse tighter, feeling the weight of every stare that swept over her, and dismissed her in the same breath. This was a world that spoke in the language of money, and she was fluent only in the dialect of survival. "Excuse me, miss." The voice came from behind her, sharp and dismissive. She turned to find a woman in a crisp black suit, her expression a careful mask of professional disdain. "This event is invitation only. I'm going to need to see your credentials." The words landed like small stones, each one bruising. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her second-hand purse, producing the printed invitation. The woman's eyes scanned it quickly, her lips pursing as if she'd tasted something bitter. "I see. And your application was for what, exactly?" The question dripped with skepticism, as though poverty itself were a communicable disease that might infect the pristine atmosphere. "A community center," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "For families who need support. Job training, childcare resources, financial literacy programs." The woman's eyebrow arched slightly, a gesture that communicated volumes without a single word. "How ambitious," she said, though the tone suggested anything but admiration. "Well, you'll find the reception area through those doors. I'd suggest you stay near the back. This event tends to attract serious investors, and we wouldn't want any uncomfortable situations." The dismissal was complete, surgical in its precision. She was being told, in the politest possible terms, that she didn't belong. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, watching as clusters of elegantly dressed people laughed and clinked crystal glasses filled with champagne that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Conversations swirled around her, discussions of market trends and investment portfolios, second homes and vacation properties. She felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller with each passing moment, until she wondered if she might disappear entirely. Had she been foolish to come? Had she misunderstood something fundamental about how this world worked? Near the back of the room, she found a quiet corner beside a towering arrangement of white orchids. From here, she could observe without being observed, could study this foreign landscape without having to navigate it. She watched as a distinguished man in his 60s took the stage, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. He was the founder of the Hartwell Foundation, a self-made billionaire who'd built his empire from nothing. The irony wasn't lost on her. Once he too had been on the outside looking in. But somehow, between then and now, he'd forgotten what that felt like. Or perhaps he simply chose not to remember. The speech began full of platitudes about innovation and entrepreneurship, about the importance of investing in tomorrow's leaders. She listened to the words, each one a small knife. Tomorrow's leaders, she realized, looked a certain way. They spoke a certain language. They wore their success like armor. And if you didn't already have that armor, if you showed up vulnerable and hopeful and poor, you were simply invisible. The foundation would award 3 grants tonight, each one a life-changing sum of $50,000. She'd spent weeks imagining what she could do with that money, the programs she could create, the families she could help, the children who might find hope in a place designed just for them. But hope, she was learning, was a luxury reserved for those who could afford to dream without apology. The first recipient was called to the stage, a young man in an expensive suit, whose tech startup had already received seed funding from his father's venture capital firm. The audience applauded enthusiastically. The second recipient followed, a woman whose innovative fashion line was being mentored by a major designer. More applause, more congratulations, more proof that success bred success, and poverty bred only more poverty. She felt something crack inside her chest, a small fracture that spread like ice across a winter pond. She shouldn't have come. She should have known better than to believe that someone like her, with her thrift store dress and her impossible dreams, could compete in a world that had already decided she wasn't worth the investment. As the third name was called, someone else's dreams celebrated while hers crumbled silently in the shadows, she made her decision. She would leave. She would walk out of this glittering palace of privilege and return to her small apartment, to her mother who worked herself to exhaustion, to her siblings who looked at her like she might be the one to change everything. But just as she turned toward the exit, just as she prepared to surrender, a hand touched her shoulder. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, and when she turned, she found herself looking into the eyes of an elderly woman dressed simply in navy blue. The woman's face was mapped with wrinkles, each line a story, and her eyes held something that had been absent from every other face in that room. Recognition. Not of who she was, but of what she'd experienced. "You're leaving," the woman said softly. It wasn't a question. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The woman smiled, sad and knowing. "I almost left too," she said. 40 years ago at a party just like this one. I was wearing a borrowed dress and shoes that didn't fit. I felt exactly like you feel right now." The words hung between them, a bridge across decades. "But I stayed," the woman continued. "And do you know what I learned? That the people who dismiss you today will be the ones asking for your help tomorrow. That rejection is often just the universe's way of redirecting you toward something better. That 30 days can change absolutely everything." She pressed something into the young woman's hand, closing her fingers around it gently. 30 days, she repeated. "Don't give up yet. Give it 30 days. Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd like a benevolent ghost, leaving behind only the weight of whatever she'd placed in that trembling palm. When she finally looked down, she found a business card, elegant and simple, with just a name, a phone number, and 4 words that would haunt her for the next month. "When you're ready, call." She left the gala that night with the business card burning a hole in her pocket, a small rectangle of possibility that felt both like a lifeline and a trap. The subway ride home was long, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as the train rattled through dark tunnels beneath the city. She stared at her reflection in the window, superimposed against the blackness rushing past, and wondered who that woman in the glass really was. Was she the failure who'd been dismissed at the gala, or was she something else entirely? Something she hadn't yet discovered. The card remained untouched for 3 days. She carried it everywhere, transferring it from pocket to pocket, but couldn't bring herself to make the call. What if it was a cruel joke? What if the elderly woman had simply been kind in the moment, but would be dismissive on the phone? Worse, what if the call led nowhere, just another dead end in a maze of dead ends? Hope, she'd learned, was dangerous. It made you vulnerable. It set you up for falls that could shatter you completely. On the 4th day, her younger brother came home from school with a black eye and a story he wouldn't tell. She knew what had happened without asking. The kids at school had discovered their mother cleaned houses for a living. They'd found out about the free lunch program, about the second-hand uniforms, about all the small humiliations that came with being poor in a world that treated poverty like a moral failure. Her brother had fought back with his fists because he didn't yet have words for the rage that comes from being judged for circumstances beyond your control. She cleaned his face gently, her own eyes burning with unshed tears, and in that moment, something hardened inside her. She couldn't give up. Not for herself, but for him, for all the children who deserved better than this endless cycle of shame and struggle. That night, she made the call. Her fingers shook as she dialed, each number a small act of courage. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and she was about to hang up when a voice answered. Warm, familiar. The voice of the woman from the gala. "I was wondering when you'd reach out," she said, and there was a smile in her words. "Are you ready to begin?" "Begin what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's response was simple, almost cryptic. "Your real education. Come to this address tomorrow at 9 in the morning. Dress comfortably. Bring your dreams, and leave your doubts at the door." The address led to a building in a part of the city she'd never visited, where the streets were lined with trees and the homes spoke of old money and older secrets. She almost turned back a dozen times, convinced she'd made a mistake, that she was walking into something she couldn't understand. But she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, until she stood before a townhouse with ivy climbing its brick facade and windows that gleamed like wise, watchful eyes. The elderly woman answered the door herself, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, looking nothing like someone who lived in a place this grand. "Come in, dear," she said. "We have work to do." The next 30 days would prove to be the most transformative of her life, though not in any way she could have anticipated. The woman, who asked to be called simply Catherine, wasn't interested in teaching her how to fit into the world that had rejected her. Instead, she was determined to show her something far more valuable: how to build her own world entirely. They started with stories. Catherine shared her own history, a tale of a young woman who'd arrived in the city 50 years ago with nothing but fierce determination and a willingness to learn. She'd been dismissed, rejected, told she'd never amount to anything because she came from the wrong side of town. But she'd understood something that took most people a lifetime to grasp. The system wasn't broken. It was designed exactly as intended, and the only way to change it was to stop asking for permission to exist within it. She'd built her first business cleaning offices at night while working a day job as a secretary. Every dollar saved, every connection made, every skill learned in the margins of exhaustion. Within 5 years, she owned the cleaning company. Within 10, she diversified into real estate. Within 20, she was funding the very foundations that had once rejected her applications for help. But the money, Catherine explained, was never the point. The point was freedom. The point was creating opportunities for others who reminded her of her younger self. The point was proving that worth wasn't determined by wealth, but by the courage to keep building when everyone said you should quit. Each day brought new lessons, but they weren't the kind taught in business schools or found in self-help books. Catherine introduced her to people, dozens of them, each with their own story of rejection and reinvention. There was the restaurant owner who'd been homeless at 25 and now employed formerly incarcerated individuals, giving them second chances the world denied. There was the tech entrepreneur who'd dropped out of high school to care for sick parents and taught herself to code in public libraries. There was the non-profit director who'd survived domestic violence and now ran shelters for women escaping similar nightmares. These weren't the polished success stories featured in magazines. These were people who'd climbed out of darkness with bloody knuckles and unbreakable spirits, who understood that real wealth was measured in lives changed, not dollars accumulated. Catherine also taught her the practical skills she'd need, the unsexy fundamentals that nobody talks about because they're not glamorous. How to read a contract and spot predatory terms, how to negotiate without apology, how to build a budget that accounted for both survival and growth, how to network authentically, building relationships based on mutual value rather than desperation, how to present her vision in ways that made people lean forward, invested, wanting to be part of something bigger than themselves. Most importantly, Catherine taught her to stop performing poverty, to stop making herself smaller in hopes that it would make others more comfortable. "Your struggle is real," Catherine said one afternoon as they worked through financial projections, "but it doesn't define you. Your vision defines you. Your commitment defines you. The question isn't whether you deserve a seat at the table. The question is whether you even want to sit at their table, or if you'd rather build your own." Sharing these stories of transformation and hidden strength isn't easy. But if you feel the weight of these truths, if you've ever been dismissed because of where you come from, subscribe and join us. Your like can spread hope to someone who needs it, and your comment might share a wisdom that changes another life. We're building something here, a community that understands that rejection is often redirection, and that the next 30 days can rewrite your entire story. By day 23, she'd rewritten her grant application entirely, transforming it from a plea for help into a compelling business proposal. She'd identified potential partnerships with local businesses who could provide in-kind donations. She'd mapped out a funding strategy that didn't rely on a single source but diversified across grants, individual donors, and earned revenue streams. She'd connected with community leaders who pledged their support. Most significantly, she'd stopped seeing herself as someone begging for scraps and started recognizing herself as someone offering value, as someone solving a real problem that affected real people. But on day 28, everything nearly fell apart. She received an email from the Hartwell Foundation, the official rejection she'd been expecting since the night of the gala. "We regret to inform you," it read, in language so formal it felt like a form letter, "that your application was not selected." The words stung less than she expected, but they still stung. She'd known it was coming, but knowing and experiencing are two different countries. She showed the email to Catherine, half expecting disappointment, half expecting sympathy. Instead, Catherine smiled. "Perfect," she said. "Now you're free." "Free from what?" she asked, confused. Catherine's eyes sparkled with something that looked like mischief and wisdom mixed in equal measure. Free from needing their approval. Free from waiting for someone else to validate your dream. Free to do what I did 40 years ago, build it yourself. The next 48 hours moved with the speed and intensity of a storm, breaking over calm waters. Catherine made a series of phone calls, each conversation brief and purposeful, speaking in the shorthand of people who'd known each other for decades and trusted completely. She was calling in favors, activating a network that existed entirely outside the traditional philanthropic world, a shadow system built by people who'd been excluded from the official channels and had created their own. By day 29, she'd assembled a meeting that would change everything, though she still didn't fully understand what was about to happen. They gathered in a private room at a modest restaurant in her own neighborhood, not the glittering ballrooms of the wealthy, but a family-owned establishment where the owner knew everyone's name, and the food came with stories. She arrived early, her stomach tight with anxiety, clutching a folder that contained her revised proposal, her financial projections, her dreams translated into numbers and timelines. Catherine was already there, seated at a large round table, and as others began to arrive, she realized with growing astonishment that she recognized several faces. The restaurant owner who'd been homeless, the tech entrepreneur who'd taught herself to code, the non-profit director who'd survived violence. Others too, people she'd never met but whose energy felt familiar, people who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of those who'd fought for every inch of ground they stood on. Catherine made the introductions simply, without ceremony, and then turned to her. "Tell them," she said gently. "Tell them what you told me. Tell them why this matters." And so she spoke not from her notes, but from her heart, about growing up watching her mother's hands crack and bleed from cleaning chemicals, about her brother's black eye, and the shame that came with being poor in a country that treated poverty like a personal defect. She spoke about the community center she envisioned not as a charity that made people feel small, but as a place of dignity where families could access resources without judgment, where children could see possibilities beyond their circumstances, where the cycle could finally be broken. She spoke about her neighborhood, about the women who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford childcare, about the men who'd made mistakes in their youth and couldn't find employment because the system was designed to punish forever, about the teenagers who had potential blazing inside them, but no roadmap for how to channel it toward something constructive. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then the restaurant owner spoke. "I'm in for 5,000, she said. "My business does well now, but I remember when I was sleeping in my car and showering at the gym. This is how we break the cycle." The tech entrepreneur nodded. "I can donate equipment, computers, software licenses. And I'll teach coding classes every Saturday morning, free." The non-profit director leaned forward. I have connections with social workers and therapists who will volunteer their time. Mental health services are expensive, but they're essential. One by one, they offered what they had, not enormous sums that would make headlines, but meaningful contributions that added up to something substantial. More than the money, though, they offered something she'd never had before: a team. People who understood the mission because they'd lived it. People who wouldn't judge her for her background because they shared it. People who were invested not because it looked good on a tax form, but because they genuinely believed in the vision. Catherine had been quiet throughout, watching with a slight smile, and finally she spoke. "I'm funding the first year's operating costs," she said, $150,000. "But there are conditions." The words landed like thunder, and everyone turned to look at her. "You will not make this about me," Catherine continued. "My name doesn't go on the building. There's no press release about my generosity. This isn't about my legacy. This is about your vision. You will run this center with complete autonomy. You'll make mistakes and you'll learn from them. You'll struggle and you'll grow stronger. And when this center is successful, when it's transformed lives and changed your neighborhood, you'll do what I did. You'll find someone else who's been rejected, who's been told they're not enough, and you'll give them their 30 days. The words settled over her like a blessing, like a burden, like both at once. She felt tears burning in her eyes but refused to let them fall. Not yet, not here. Instead, she stood and walked around the table, embracing each person. These strangers who were now partners, these warriors who understood that real change didn't come from the top down, but from the ground up, built by people who refused to accept the world as it was and insisted on creating the world as it should be. This moment, she knew, was the hinge on which her entire life would turn. Everything before had been preparation, and everything after would be purpose. That night, she returned to her small apartment where her mother was asleep on the couch after another 12-hour shift, where her siblings were doing homework at a kitchen table that wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others, and she felt a wave of love so intense it almost knocked her down. She wouldn't tell them yet, not until everything was finalized, not until the money was in the bank and the lease was signed and the dream was concrete enough to touch. But soon. Soon she'd be able to tell them that everything was about to change, that the struggle that had defined their lives was about to transform into something else, something better. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. Possible, within reach. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been told you don't belong, subscribe and stay with us. Your like helps this message reach someone who needs to hear it today, and your comment might carry a truth that saves someone from giving up. We're here because we believe in the power of community, in the strength of those who refuse to be broken, in the miracle of 30 days that change everything. Drop a comment and tell us about a time someone believed in you when no one else did. Your story matters. Your voice matters. You matter. Day 30 arrived not with fanfare but with quiet determination. She woke early, before dawn, and walked through her neighborhood in the blue-gray light of morning. She saw it differently now, not through the lens of shame but through the eyes of possibility. Every boarded-up storefront was a potential location. Every struggling family was a future success story. Every child was a leader waiting to emerge. The rejection from the Hartwell Foundation sat in her email inbox, but it no longer had power over her. It was simply information, data, feedback that told her she'd been looking for validation in the wrong place. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their money. She had something better. She had people who believed in her. She had a vision that was born from lived experience, and she had the courage to build something from nothing. She met Catherine for coffee that morning, at the same modest restaurant where the meeting had taken place, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a moment. "You did it," Catherine said finally. "You gave it 30 days. She smiled, feeling the weight of the journey, the transformation that had occurred not just in her circumstances, but in her fundamental understanding of herself and her worth. "I almost gave up," she admitted, "on day 4, on day 12, on day 28. I almost walked away so many times." Catherine nodded, her old eyes knowing. "That's the point. 30 days isn't magic. It's commitment. It's choosing every single day to keep building even when everything tells you to quit. It's understanding that rejection isn't the universe saying no. It's the universe saying not this way, try another door. The community center opened its doors on a Tuesday morning in late spring, 3 months after that initial 30-day period that had changed everything. The building wasn't grand, just a renovated storefront on a street corner where kids used to loiter and deals used to go down. But inside it was transformed. Bright paint-covered walls that had been tagged with graffiti. Donated computers lined tables where people could learn new skills. A childcare area in the back meant parents could attend classes without worrying about their children. A kitchen where cooking classes would teach nutrition on a budget. Meeting rooms where job interview skills could be practiced, where resumes could be crafted, where small business plans could be developed. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, solid, tangible proof that dreams didn't require permission from gatekeepers who'd never struggled. The first person through the door was a woman in her 40s, tired eyes and calloused hands, who reminded her so much of her own mother, it hurt. She'd seen the flyer at the laundromat, the simple announcement that listed free services with no judgment, no applications asking about criminal history or immigration status, just help offered freely to anyone who needed it. The woman stood in the doorway looking uncertain, as if waiting for the catch, for the moment when someone would tell her she didn't qualify, that she wasn't eligible, that she needed to prove her worthiness before receiving assistance. Instead, she walked up, introduced herself, and asked simply what the woman needed. Not what she thought she deserved, not what she felt comfortable asking for, but what she actually needed to change her life. By the end of the first week, they'd served 43 people. By the end of the first month, that number had grown to over 200. Word spread the way truth always spreads in communities that have been overlooked and underestimated, person to person, family to family, through the networks of trust that exist below the surface of official channels. People came for job training and stayed for the community. They came for childcare and discovered mentorship. They came expecting charity and found dignity instead. The center became more than a place. It became proof of concept, evidence that people didn't need saving. They needed resources and respect and someone willing to invest in their potential rather than judge their circumstances. But success brought challenges she hadn't anticipated. There were days when the needs overwhelmed the resources, when she had to turn people away or put them on waiting lists, when the gap between what they could provide and what was needed felt impossibly wide. There were nights when she lay awake, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake, if she'd created something that would ultimately fail and disappoint all the people who'd started to hope again. The weight of other people's dreams was heavy, heavier than her own had ever been, because now she wasn't just responsible for herself, but for an entire community that had begun to believe that change was possible. On one particularly difficult day, 6 months after opening, when a funding source had fallen through and she was calculating how many weeks they could operate before running out of money, Catherine appeared at the center unannounced. She walked through, slowly observing everything: the children in the childcare area, working on art projects, the adults in the computer lab, learning Excel, the group in the meeting room, practicing job interviews, the teenagers in the corner, working on college applications. Then she turned with that knowing smile and said something that would sustain her through every difficult moment that followed. "You know what the difference is between you and the people at that gala? They build monuments to themselves. You're building movements. Monuments crumble, movements change the world." The words proved prophetic. By the end of the first year, the center had served over 1,500 people. 42 individuals had found employment, 18 had started small businesses, 7 had gone back to school, 3 had escaped domestic violence situations. Dozens of children had been cared for while their parents worked or learned. The numbers were impressive, but they didn't capture the real transformation, the invisible shifts that happened when people who'd been told they were worthless began to believe they had value. The single mother who stopped apologizing for taking up space. The formerly incarcerated man who learned he could be defined by his future rather than his past. The teenager who started talking about college instead of just surviving to graduation. These were the metrics that mattered, the measurements that couldn't be quantified on grant applications, but were written in the changed energy of the neighborhood itself. And then, exactly 1 year after she'd been rejected at the Hartwell Foundation Gala, she received an unexpected email. It was from the foundation's new director, a woman who'd recently taken over and was reviewing past applications. The email was personal, not a form letter, acknowledging that her application had been dismissed unfairly, noting that the center she'd built was exactly the kind of innovative, community-driven work the foundation should have supported. They wanted to meet. They wanted to discuss a substantial grant. They wanted to feature her as a success story in their annual report. She read the email twice, 3 times, waiting for the surge of validation she'd once craved. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt something close to indifference. She no longer needed their approval. She'd already built what she set out to create, and she'd done it without them. She met with the foundation director anyway, not because she needed them, but because she recognized an opportunity to change the system from within. She accepted their grant, but with conditions of her own. The money would fund satellite centers in 3 other underserved neighborhoods. The foundation would revise its application process to remove barriers that automatically excluded people from low-income backgrounds. They would commit to funding grassroots organizations led by people with lived experience, not just polished non-profits run by people who'd never struggled. And most importantly, they would create a fellowship program specifically for applicants who'd been previously rejected, giving them the mentorship and support she'd received from Catherine. The foundation director agreed to everything, understanding that she was being given not just a grant recipient, but a teacher, someone who could show them what they'd been missing all along. 2 years after that night at the gala, she stood in the original center watching an orientation for new members, and she saw herself in their faces that mixture of hope and fear, that desperate need to believe that things could be different, mixed with the learned expectation of disappointment. She thought about the business card that had changed everything, about Catherine's simple instruction to give it 30 days, about how close she'd come to giving up before the transformation could begin. And she understood now what Catherine had known all along. Rejection wasn't the end of the story. It was often the beginning of the real one, the one where you stopped waiting for permission and started building your own door. That same week, she attended a small networking event for local non-profits, nothing fancy, just coffee and conversation in a community room. And there, standing uncertainly near the back, she saw a young man in clothes that didn't quite fit, eyes that held that familiar mixture of determination and doubt. She recognized him instantly, not because she knew him, but because she'd been him. She watched as others in the room glanced at him and looked away, as he seemed to shrink into himself, as he calculated whether he should stay or leave. She walked over before he could make the decision to go. She introduced herself. She asked about his dreams, and then, at the end of their conversation, she pressed her business card into his hand. 30 days, she said gently. Don't give up yet. Give it 30 days. When you're ready, call. This was the true measure of success, she realized. Not the grants awarded or the services provided, but the continuation of the cycle, the passing forward of the gift she'd been given. Catherine had invested in her not because she was special, but because she recognized potential that others had dismissed. Now it was her turn to be that person for someone else, to be the unexpected hand on the shoulder, the voice that said you matter, the bridge between who someone was and who they could become. The young man looked at the card the way she once had, like it might be salvation or might be nothing at all. And she smiled because she knew that he would carry it for days, uncertain, afraid, hopeful. And eventually, when he was ready, he would call, and the cycle would continue. The movement would grow. The monuments would fade, but the impact would ripple outward in ways that could never be measured, but would absolutely be felt. She thought about the woman at the gala, the one in the crisp black suit who'd dismissed her, who'd suggested she stay near the back, who'd made her feel small. She wondered sometimes if that woman even remembered the interaction, if it had registered at all in her consciousness, or if it had been so routine, so automatic, that it had been forgotten before the evening ended. She bore no hatred for that woman now, only a kind of distant pity, because that woman had been given the opportunity to recognize potential and had missed it completely, had been so blinded by surface appearances that she'd failed to see the determination underneath. And in failing to see her, that woman had failed herself, had proven that all her polish and professionalism couldn't compensate for a fundamental lack of vision. The rejection had been a gift, though she couldn't have known it at the time. It had freed her from seeking validation from people who would never truly understand her mission. It had redirected her toward Catherine, toward the shadow network of people who built from the ground up, toward a model of success that measured impact rather than prestige. Most importantly, it had taught her that the system's rejection wasn't a reflection of her worth, but of the system's limitations. The gatekeepers weren't omniscient. They were simply human, limited by their own experiences and biases, capable of missing brilliance because it didn't arrive in the packaging they expected. Now, when young people came to the center carrying their own rejections, their own stories of being dismissed and overlooked, she shared her story. Not to inspire them with some fairy tale of overnight success, but to show them the messy, difficult, beautiful truth of building something meaningful. She told them about the 30 days that changed her life. She told them about the moments when she almost quit. She told them about Catherine and the network of warriors who understood that real change required people who'd lived the struggle. And she told them the most important truth of all, that they didn't need anyone's permission to change the world. They just needed courage to start and commitment to continue. This was her story, the journey from rejection to purpose, from shame to strength, from invisibility to impact. But it was also their story, the collective narrative of everyone who'd ever been told they weren't enough and decided to prove that the measurement itself was flawed. Every person who walked through the center's doors carried their own version of this tale, their own 30 days waiting to unfold, their own potential waiting to be recognized, not by gatekeepers, but by themselves. And together they were building something that couldn't be torn down by a single rejection or undermined by a single setback. They were building proof that worth isn't determined by wealth, that success doesn't require the right connections or the right background, that the most powerful force in the world is people who refuse to believe the lies they have been told about their own limitations. If this story touched something in you, if you've carried your own rejections and wondered if you'd ever be enough, then join this community. Subscribe so you never miss these journeys of transformation. Like this video so it reaches someone who needs to hear it today, and please share your story in the comments. Tell us about your 30 days, about the moment someone believed in you, about the rejection that redirected you toward your purpose. Your voice adds to this chorus of resilience. Your story might be the one that gives someone else permission to keep going. Together, we celebrate not monuments but movements, not perfection but persistence, not gatekeepers but the courage to build our own doors. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing that change is possible. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, remember that you are worthy, you are valuable, and your story deserves to be told.